I'm Dr. Vanessa Sinclair, and this is Rendering Unconscious. Today we have a panel from the conference Psychoanalysis, Art, and the Occult, held at Candid Arts Trust, London, in May 2016. First, we have Val Denham with her talk, Proclaim Present Time Over. Then, Langston Kahn with The Thing Which Knowledge Can't Eat, Gods, Archetypes, and the Mind. And finally, Graham Duff presenting Sublime Fragments, The Art of John Balance, moderated by Caleigh Fisher. Papers from the Psychoanalysis, Art, and the Occult Conference have been collected together into the Fenris Wolf, Volume 9, edited by myself and Carl Abrahamsson. Available from trapart.net. Rendering Unconscious is also a book. Rendering Unconscious, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry. Available from Trapart Books, 2019. Please visit our publisher's website, www.trapart.net. You can support the podcast by visiting our Patreon, patreon.com/VANESSA23CARL. Your support is greatly appreciated. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode.
Val Denham, born November 14th, 1957 in Yorkshire, is the kind of artist you'd normally expect to learn about only after their passing, when crates of wonderfully obsessive detailed artworks and diaries would be revealed Darger-like to an unsuspecting public. Because, unlike the majority of a generation of UK artists, neither her interest nor her talent is first and foremost in self-promotion, but in the obsessive creation of her art, the expression of her uniquely personal vision, her obsessions, her manias, her struggles, and her life path. Formerly trained at Bradford College and the Royal College of Art in London, she has been originally associated with that true countercultural revolution of the late 70s and early 80s, which came to be known as industrial culture, creating a lot of visual hallmarks of that genre and releasing her first own musical efforts via the then thriving tape scene. Apart from creating richly detailed works which deal with personal themes like her OCD, gender dysphoria, and transgender issues, she is also an accomplished portrait artist. Her style is easily identifiable, even though she has never limited herself to one particular mode of expression only. She is equally versatile in lifelike figurative art and in abstract forms. 2 volumes of her art and thoughts have been published by Timeless Editions out of Toulouse in 2012 and 2015 respectively, and met with wide approval. Apart from releasing her series of handmade CDs of music, Val has also collaborated with various bands on her sound works. Val Denham.
Thank you. Okay. Proclaim Present Time Over. I stole the title from William Burroughs' short piece in a paperback book called The Award Avant-Garde Reader, published 1965. I don't feel too much guilt about stealing such a great title because Uncle Bill stole it from Brian Geisen, who in turn probably stole it from me in the future. Now, please do bear with me. Some of what I am about to say will not immediately make sense, But keep listening and I'll explain soon why I've written like this at the beginning of my piece. So, what does proclaim present time over mean? Well, I'm not certain, but for me it means to continually state this moment is now. To awake from the dream for a second and realise that one is dreaming. We are all dreaming all the time, not just in sleep, but even when awake. We cannot keep continual awareness of the present because it moves too fast. Time, as part of the fourth dimension space-time, is travelling at 186,000 miles per hour, or the speed of light. We are hurtling very fast towards our death. The instant we grasp the notion of this is now, it is gone, over and already in the past. So we cope with this enigma of speeding time by dreaming 24 hours a day. I am not here. Neither are you. We are atoms, molecules, each the size of a cathedral, held in place by electrons flying around protons and neutrons at the speed of light. Stardust from the Big Bang. Art does not exist, it is merely God dreaming. Proto-deist poetry embalmed in subatomic structures as divine alchemical recordings. Inanimate objects lost in time and space. Does a chair think? Can a table love? Does a carpet feel sad? Perhaps consciousness could be a form of DNA circuit board inherent in the unknown soul of art. The richest soul implantations that ask the question, is art alive? Art does not exist. Cassette recordings lying dormant as soul maps in paintings that only communicate when viewed in the past or in the future. There is no present. The universe itself is so eager to be known. The evolution of the species since the Big Bang that one day will ask questions such as, what is the universe? Why are we here? Dark energy exploding out from the singularity of the Big Bang as gravitationally suspended invisible spiderwebs hold and pull the universe into order. Consciousness is an energy that must remain in the universe until the big crunch. Dark consciousness as a constant energy, dark love and dark hate. May the force be with you, may not be as silly as we imagined. Nothing is stationary because all atoms are forever dancing. Perhaps inanimate objects retain a memory. Art is haunted. Art has a soul. In these rational, atheist times of logic and science, why do we need to demolish houses where murders have taken place? It is very deep within the human psyche that stones, bricks, furniture, wallpaper, etc. can record negative energy and become toxic or somehow tainted. Tainted with memory. If you own a painting, then you own a fraction of the artist. It has got a bit of the artist's essence inside the atomic structure. The artist is aware when work attains a soul, it becomes conscious at a subatomic level, and possibly at a universal level. Serotonin paths and connections reflects the dark matter and dark energy of the universe. Everything is birth and death, yin and yang. Our universe was born from the death of the previous universe. When that previous universe was crushed into a singularity, an impossible situation made by dark energy in the previous universe, collecting together so many black holes that it formed the ultimate black hole of the Big Crunch. The result of that Big Crunch was that matter was squashed into no space at all, and then was spewed out in reverse at the other side of the black hole. And that was our Big Bang. So the universe as we know it is only the recent one to us anywhere. So, why have I told you all this? And why have I told you it in this strange manner? I have done so because this information hidden deep within my subconscious was given to me when my brain told me all this stuff one night I was washing up. I wrote it up afterwards, letting go and letting the thoughts tumble unedited out of my head. So that part of this talk represents subconscious writing or subconscious thinking. Dreams make us creative. We dream when we are awake. This is particularly true of creatives. Everyone is aware of dreams being wish fulfillment, so as to create art, poetry, stories, paintings, film, plays and music, etc. It is necessary to dream away. We all balance our foreconscious and our subconscious every day. We need our intuition to guide us. Every audience or every medium also brings their subconscious to bear too. For example, with every novel and radio play, each member of the audience uses their own dreaming to create the pictures that close the circle between the artist and themselves. This is important. Art is interactive. In certain individuals, particularly creatives, balance is in favour of the subconscious, the predominant mechanism of new forms of reason. An example might be me mixing certain colours accurately with hardly any thought, my subconscious manifesting as intuition born of long experience. It allows me to know how to mix any given colour I need. The information is innate. Likewise, a painting or work of art is a wish fulfillment. Even when we think back to the Renaissance, for example, it is the patron or commissioner's wish that is being fulfilled by the artist and his workshop. The wish fulfillment in regards to the paintings I make goes something like this. Born of my subconscious, I see the completed painting in my mind and I wish that it existed. I make it so by using my analytical foreconscious in combination with my naturalistic artistic subconscious reasoning. I believe that sometimes my subconscious mind can remind me in my dreams to create future artworks that I am not aware of as yet. Here is a good example. First, though, is the memory on which it is based. I briefly met a bookshop owner in 2004 in Cartmel, Cumbria, when I was on my honeymoon. He was very memorable as he was eccentric, ancient, and like a huge Churchill figure. He was just entering the 18th year of an engagement to his lady love. He was sat at his desk near the front of the shop and was working his way through several sandwiches. I rummaged around the books for ages. We got chatting to the owner and he said to my wife and me, "Look at this, I can't even sell this because it's not politically correct." It was a little book called The Story of Little Black Sambo. "You can have it," he said. The front cover was missing and I still use it as a tea mount on my bedside nowadays. Anyway, that's the bit there that really did happen. That's true. Now for the clearly remembered dream which I had in 2010. In the dream, I was in a chaotic bric-a-brac shop and the proprietor of it was the bookshop owner of memory that I had in my dream. I examined the vases in the junk shop, but I don't see anything spectacular. Then my eyes were drawn to the only CD album in the shop because of its simple red, yellow and black cover. I picked it up and it had a joyous-looking cover with an anachronistic Art Deco style woman's profile on it. Her hair was blown in the breeze, her face was bright yellow and the background was red. There was one word written in her hair, the word "mad." I was intrigued to know who did the album of songs, so I flipped it over and was surprised to find that the artist was myself, Denham. I was so excited to find a whole album of songs that I'd written that I didn't know existed. I asked the old proprietor what the price was. It's £50, he said. Why is it so expensive, I wanted to know? Because the cover is hand-painted and there are only 23 copies, he replied. Having insufficient funds, I waited in my dream until the proprietor had his back to me, and then I put the CD under my coat and showed it as I wanted it so much. I couldn't wait to hear it. You know, an old album of my stuff that I've never heard of. But then I woke up and I was disappointed never to have heard such an album. Now I'm going to stop recounting the dream here, as I'm sure you know where it's going. The truth is that I made that CD exactly as I dreamt about it, right down to it being an edition of 23 with painted covers. It took several months to make the album, but they all went in one week. Incidentally, one of the tracks is called Hey Sigmund Freud. And another track is called Black Hole. Now, in 2006, I was asked to paint an image of the back, the cover, front and back cover, of Langston's Productions' double CD album, The Impossibility of Silence. I asked the boys what they wanted, and their response was, "It's up to you, Val, you'll come up with something good." So I slept on it, and I had a dream that the cover was of giant boys of different colours reclining in the hills of Yorkshire. I have a track on the album called Yorkshire Hills. The giant boys were naked with figs in place of their heads. The sun was eclipsed by a black spider star. I painted this image more or less exactly as I saw it in my dream. Now my dream is locked in time on that cover as long as a copy exists. Dreams can tell us so much. They can be psychic premonitions or mysterious divinations, remote internal supernatural visualizations of places and events that we have never even seen or experienced. One example of this dates from the late 1970s. When I came to live in London, so as to attend the Royal College of Art, and it was Christmas 1979, I went back to Leeds to visit my parents. My mother told me that she'd had a dream in which she had followed me into the art college. In her dream, she was invisible, and I was completely unaware of her presence. She followed a few yards behind me as I walked. She described the building at the back of the big museum. She described going through an arched doorway and up stone steps and up to a uniformed Scottish man who sat behind glass in a kiosk. She described how I signed a big book there, and how I made the Scottish man laugh with one of the many different silly voices I greeted him with each day. She told me that I turned left through a door and went right down a big long corridor which was painted all white. Then up a narrow staircase to the top where a studio was with a big skylight for windows in its ceiling. She described the big long desk I used and the boy with glasses that I sat next to. I was astonished by her dream, and the more I questioned her about it, I discovered it was completely accurate. My mother had never been to London at this point in her life. She'd certainly never been to the Royal College of Art. I told her that what she'd seen was completely true and accurate, and her response was, "I know it is. I just needed to see where you were." A further example is when I was a child, I would sometimes experience nightmares, something which may be frequent in childhood as children try to work out how to deal with everyday fears. One such nightmare I had was so extreme that I have never forgotten it. In the dream, I found that my parents had gone out somewhere, leaving me alone in the house at night. I decided I should go to bed, and I went to switch the light on at the bottom of the stairs, but the bulb was dead. There was very little light, and at the top of the stairs it was completely dark. I felt anxious and began to panic. To my horror, I saw a young boy, a teenager, walking down the stairs towards me. He moved slowly. He was all white, his face was white, but around his eyes were black corpse-like smudges, with his staring eyes unblinking. His hair was stuck out as if it was filled with electricity. And his hair was white too. He was very thin indeed. I was afraid that he might be dead. He came very close to me and reached out his hand to touch me. At this point in the dream, I awoke screaming, and my parents ran into my bedroom to comfort me. It took a long time to calm me down. After that particular nightmare, because I was so distraught, I thought on this dream for a long time afterwards. Then, when I was 19, the dream came true. One Friday night, I had been out in Bradford with my friends at the art college. We had been to our usual late-night venue called Max, just down the road from the college. I was very wild in those days, and I didn't even bother with taxis home. I simply ran from Bradford to Leeds. Do that now. I would run like a comic book character, The Flash. And when I did arrive home, it would be so late that I was careful not to wake my parents, especially my father, who I didn't get on with at the time. I would carefully unlock the door and creep upstairs to wash my face and get ready for bed. I didn't need to switch any lights on that particular night, as there was a full moon, which lit the bathroom and the landing. I went to the sink in front of the bathroom window. There was a mirror hung from the frame. I looked up from where I bent over the sink to brush my teeth and caught sight of my reflection. I was absolutely horrified. The moonlight on my face made it appear white, my makeup had all smudged blackly around my eyes, and my blonde hair was stuck in all directions from my wild run, and it appeared white in the moonlight. I was very thin at that age too, anorexic actually. And I realised that at 19 on this night, this was the phantom from my childhood nightmare. I was my own ghost all along. I had simply seen the future when I was a child. That night I went to bed and I dreamt. I dreamt that I was walking slowly down the stairs of my childhood home, and that at the bottom of the stairs was a very scared little boy with blonde hair. I wanted to comfort him. I just wanted to hold his hand and tell him not to be frightened, that everything was fine and it was only a bad dream. But as I went to placate him, I awoke. One final example of how dreams can bend time and space. Dreams are wish fulfillments. I continued to live in London when I graduated from the Royal College of Art. And when I was coming towards the end of my rocky first marriage, which was around the time of the millennium, I had a dream about being back in Yorkshire. In that dream, I was sat on a bench in the summertime with the sparkly stars reflected in the sunlight, dancing on the calm water of Chelodine Reservoir in Bradford. I was sat holding hands with my first girlfriend, Gail Shackleton. She'd been the first girlfriend I'd ever had when I was 17 years old, and we were at Bradford Art College together. I woke from the dream with an exquisite ethereal feeling of nostalgia for happier times. And then one day, that scene also became reality. I did sit on that very bench. It was summer and the sun was out and the water sparkled, and I was holding hands with Gail once more. We'd been together again for 15 years this summer and married for 12 of those. The two sides of reality, dreaming and being awake, the foreconscious and the subconscious, age and youth, love and hate, require balance. Yin and yang in my own case, and in my own case, male and female. In my dreams, I am often, but by no means always, male. This doesn't disturb me in the least, as I find it so interesting, and I know that it is a psychological balancing mechanism that I need. I enjoy going to bed, and the warm and cosy drift into sleep. The twilight where I'm neither awake nor asleep, but lie somewhere on the border of both states. It induces a drugged feeling, a great sense of comfort, and a great sense of comfort takes hold of me. When I dream I am male, I don't even look as I did when I presented as male. In my dreamscapes, I am ultra-masculine, often bearded with short hair. I flirt with attractive young women and often have sexual intercourse with them. I enjoy these dreams and often find myself aroused. Strangely, if I fantasise during my waking hours, then I am always a woman and imagine myself as subservient to a dominant man. When I dream I am female, I dream I am younger than I am now. An attractive woman at the height of her desirability. The other aspect of my psychological profile worth mentioning is that I have quite severe obsessive-compulsive disorder. One part of this is that I have extreme coniophobia, which is the fear of dust. These problems manifest disturbingly, often in my dreams with scenarios of plaster falling from walls, shit-smeared loose seats, wet carpets and layers of dust on surfaces that I have to clean. I dream of being at art college often, even though it is 34 years since I was last in one. Often I dream it is the last day before I leave, so there is some sort of psychological connection to this within me. Between Bradford and the Royal College of Art, I was a student for 7 years, so perhaps leaving college was frightening to me, as it meant I had to join the real world. Change makes me feel very insecure. I want everything to be the same forever, yet life is always about change. Daily, I am aware of fluctuations between my fore and subconscious. Another offshoot of my OCD is a very mild form of Tourette's syndrome. I get hooked on nonsensical phrases, words, or noises and snatches of song, and I am compelled to repeat them. It's very mild, as it mostly takes place in the safety of our home. The interesting aspect of it is, for example, that I might start singing "Fly Me to the Moon" for no apparent reason, as I wash up. Then I make a game of wondering why I sang that particular song, and there is always a reason. It's like join the dots. I may have seen a bee through the window in search of pollen. A bee, a buzzy bee, Buzz Aldrin, the second man on the moon. So, fly me to the moon. Every image I paint, every word I write, every song I compose has a very solid and logical foundation. It's just that I can't always see it. So what I do is I trust myself. I trust that dialogue between my fore and subconscious, between my sleep dreams and my awake dreams, and I always follow up my intuitions, which are the instructions that my mind is giving me. If the reason for the particular set of instructions is unfathomable, what does it matter? The unknowingness is like the mystery of the universe. What is magic other than undiscovered physics? I have spoken mostly about artist creatives, as that is my area of expertise. I do think, though, that what I've said applies across the whole of humanity. On the other side of the coin are the scientists, and I hope you see that without their dreamings, then many discoveries would never have been made. Scientists are logical creatives. Finally, as it is our 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death, I cannot resist quoting Prospero's most famous speech from The Tempest. Our revels are now ended. These are our actors. As I foretold you, we're all spirits and are melted into air, into thin air. And like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which it inherits shall dissolve. And like this unsubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made of, and our little life is rounded with a sleep.
Practice is informed by inner relationship focusing and African-American conjure with a foundation in the contemporary shamanic cosmology of the last mask community. You can find out more about his work at occupyyourheart.com.
Thank you. So, I think somewhat appropriately after I
Gary's talk, I wanted to start my talk with a little bit of shade from Jung that he was delivering to scientific materialists when he gave a lecture at the Sofingia Society in 1895, actually before he became involved with psychoanalysis with Freud. So this is the quote from Jung. "The principle of inertia, innate to humankind, permits us to comprehend why nowadays, in the age of the hypercritical mind, we still see educated people in every walk of life, and not least among them physicians and natural scientists, who are not ashamed to proclaim their adherence to materialism, thus bearing witness to their own intellectual poverty. To be sure, one cannot blame these people too much, for they are only aping a well-known model. After all, we cannot demand that everyone should think for himself." So, when I stumbled upon that, I found it very interesting in the context that I think often in modern psychoanalysis and psychology as a field as a whole, Jungian psychology is sometimes used as an excuse, so to speak, to approach the numinous and the divine and deities as mental constructs. That it gives permission, we can work with these things, but only in this very safe psychological framework. So I thought it was very interesting that even before Jung became involved with psychoanalysis, he always had this bent towards very systematically attacking scientific materialism as a force he saw as, actually literally he says, poisoning the minds of youth in his culture. And I think today another reason that psychology is so based in scientific materialism is also in part in an era of managed care where insurance companies put great pressure on psychotherapists to use empirically validated treatments for resolving specific problems and symptoms. I think there's another added pressure that ends up sort of castrating maybe the more cosmic potentialities of working with these numinous forces that were so present in a lot of Jung's work. And I think it's interesting also then to look at how when the break between Jung and Freud occurred, a lot of people say, it was the supernatural that caused the break, as Gary spoke about very eloquently. But I think what's interesting when you look at that moment is how what Jung was finding was that as he was using Freud's analysis to unpackage and unmask, so to speak, the world's myth, always getting back to that core drama around the libido, he found that he was becoming enthralled with these myths, and he didn't have his own myth. He started asking this question of, where can I find my myth? Where can I find my soul? And that's what led him to write the Red Book, which was, before he was writing it as a book, was simply his own experiments with active imagination, exploring his own interior landscape, but also engagement with these numinous forces that were coming into his life at the time. And so I guess to step back a bit, I think it's just interesting to notice that when Jung writes the Red Book, he doesn't use any of the psychological frameworks that he had available to him at the time to describe what he was experiencing. So rather than framing what he's experiencing in the context of archetypes or even psychological analysis, instead he is very much just almost using the language of literature or drama or poetry or myth to describe what's occurring to him as he's engaging with these entities that are coming into his life, or these internal images as well that are popping up in his dreams and his experiences. And later on, he then creates concepts and categories from his experience to try to aid others in navigating their own psyches, their own souls. And in doing so, he tries to fit that into the framework of psychoanalysis. But I think when you look at the legacy of him trying to create these concepts like archetypes or like the puer archetype, in doing so, the legacy that gets left is further obfuscation and confusion and justification to become further ingrained in scientific materialism, even when engaging with these numinous forces, rather than what he intended. And I don't know exactly what he intended, but he does say later in life that people have misunderstood the archetypes. He makes that statement. That's a very interesting statement. And so in seeing how in the Red Book, which, even when he made commentary and edited his later commentary in the Red Book, like a decade later, he still never used those psychological concepts that he had spent his life developing to describe what he was experiencing. And so I think, for me, what I think is useful in trying to extract how Jung's work with the Red Book can reflect on how we might engage with these numinous forces today is, rather than putting his work in the context of psychology and trying to categorize and compartmentalize it, putting it in the context of indigenous shamanic practices and indigenous shamanic cosmologies. So I think one way of doing that is to really just, first of all, just talk about a few highlights of his experiences. So like for those of you who haven't read the Red Book or explored it, this is a really sort of terrifying and harrowing journey through the underworld and the realms of the dead that Jung is taking us on, that really goes into the heart of madness and eventually out the other side. This includes things like the prophet Elijah appearing to Jung and screaming at him that, I am not in your head, I am not a mental construct, essentially. It includes him battling with a bull god and shrinking that bull god down, and then replanting him as a seed and raising up the old horn god from him. It involves him hordes of Anabaptist dead hurtling through his kitchen. And then he starts having an argument with, asking them, that they're talking about going to Jerusalem, going to this holy place, and he starts talking to them about, so can I go with you? It sounds like a good place. And they say, no, you have a body, you can't come with us. And then finally he just, as they're still in his kitchen, invading his space, overwhelming him, this horde of dead people, he asked them, why are you still stuck here? Why are you restless dead? And they respond to him in that moment, you have to tell us why we're still restless dead. That's what we're here for. And so then, after some heated discussion, he finally tells them that they can't rest because they did not fully live their lives. He ends the conversation actually by saying, let go, Damon, you did not live your animal. And so in doing this and calling out these dead people who are stuck on this earthly plane because they did not follow their animal, their instinct, their primal selves, that Jung was also often very interested in getting back and integrating into the Western ego, the sort of animal self. He then actually is committed to a mental institution in that moment because police come, hearing him making all of this clatter and noise, and after he's talking to them about what's going on, after like a psychologist gives him a very short evaluation, he's like, well, you're crazy, and he's diagnosed with temporary religious insanity. So at that moment, his visions, his experiencing the spirits that are coming into his life don't end, of course. And so in moments he's not even aware that he's no longer in his home as he's engaging with these forces. And I think that rather than continuing on in what's happening in the Red Book, I think it's interesting to go to what he says much later on after he's come out of this experience. Actually, I think near the end of his life, he says, had I not been able to absorb the overpowering force of the original experiences, I would have gone mad. Which he states in his epilogue to the Red Book. And I think there is, similar to what Kai was talking about, is one of the key ways that Jung's experience, or maybe a little doorway in, that we can parallel to shamanic indigenous experiences, is that when people are having these initiatory crises in these shamanic cultures, it is not about just going somewhere deep and engaging with this crazy stuff and then I survived, awesome. Like, it's essentially a rigorous stretching and ultimately breaking of a person, a guiding of a person towards that which they think they will die if they face. And then once they face that thing, they do die. And in that moment, they move through that gate of initiation, if they're lucky. And so, but to move through that gateway of initiation, it requires interpreting correctly the symbolic language that the helping spirits are using to communicate with the shaman. So I think it's very interesting how Jung makes the point just very intuitively that if I had not been able to absorb this experience, I would have been overpowered by it. And I think in that, using that phrase absorb, he's not saying, he doesn't use the word assimilate. He doesn't use the word like, put this back into the context of the framework of my life. He's talking about the ability to interpret what's being shown to him and recreate himself anew in the context of those messages that he's receiving. And so I think it's interesting to then examine how did Jung, as a Westerner, completely divorced from any context for the experiences that he was having in that moment, manage to accurately interpret the language of his helping spirits, if you wish to call the forces he was experiencing that, and pass through this gate of madness successfully. And of course, Jung was, as we've already discussed somewhat, very exposed to many different occult traditions, and many indigenous traditions as well. But if you read his writing, he often has a fear of what he calls becoming too black, which is what he meant when he said that was essentially going native. He had this fear of getting lost in a context in which everything that he was experiencing was just completely accepted. So he simultaneously was taking these events at face value, but also having extreme skepticism and extreme fear of losing himself within these experiences. So there was this constant tension throughout. But I think that's actually somewhat what saves him, in a sense, and allows him, where some people might have come to this experience and thought, I am God, I'm a prophet, I have all these messages to deliver to the people. And we've seen some people in culture that do have these visionary experiences and do go that route of creating a cult for themselves and around themselves. But because he always kept that skepticism, and sometimes it was doubt, but sometimes it was that healthy skepticism that was a constant questioning of everything he was experiencing while also accepting what he was experiencing. So there is that sense of, rather than doubting that the experience was happening, he was doubting his interpretation of the experience and that his experience was special. So he was constantly, or something he actually says is, when the voices speak to you, when anything comes, you must engage with them as literally as you can. And then the reflection is in another tone, in another mindset, but the engagement has to be literal. And so I think that's one of the things that actually makes Jung quite unique in Western culture, that he was able to hold that bridge while having these experiences of simultaneously accepting as literal the visions that he was experiencing and engaging with them as such, while also then setting aside separate time for reflection. which, if you talk with many people, many spirit workers in various traditions, there's often a bisecting of the vision itself that you're receiving, which you interpret or analyze as little as possible, then the interpretation you make of that vision, and then the action you take based on that interpretation, and then the allowing of the world to reflect back to you if that interpretation was correct, if that action you took was correct, in terms of how the world responds to that action. So I think Jung, in taking these experiences at face value, but then also keeping his reflection there, but compartmentalized, actually saved himself, in a sense, from total madness or just total inability to engage with what was happening to him. But of course, it also was that source of that tension. So I think then that gets distorted somewhat later on, in terms of when he tries to categorize his experiences that he's having later on for people to use in their own psychological explorations and own explorations of the soul. It allows people to fall into the trap, which he has specifically stated is not what he was trying to do, of narrowing Jungian psychology into a sort of astrology of the soul. We're like, oh yes, I'm fitting into this archetype now, so that means this is happening. Or oh yes, I'm fitting into this archetype now, so I should do this. Rather than using the tools that he used to be able to engage as literal with the spirit experiences he was having and interpret them and then take action on them in his life. So he was constantly obsessed with the idea that his job was to be a ferryman to the underworld and back. Not just saying, not just sort of eschewing the day world, but going into this underworld space and then bringing it back for the people. And I think on top of that, what really helped him in this moment, which also parallels, I think, spirit workers in many cultures, is that he always let the psychic events happen of their own accord that he was experiencing. And this is something he talks about a lot in his introduction to The Secret of the Golden Flower. And he's talking about the realization of the significance of letting things happen of their own accord. Just allowing the spontaneous emergence of figures, the stepping back, and the attempting to take stock and to follow what ensues. So rather than trying to shape these spirit experiences that he was having them and fit them into his psychological framework, what he was doing in those moments was actually trying to just keep up with the spiritual experiences he was having. And if you read the Red Book, what he's constantly doing is, rather than saying, okay, this spirit is doing this, that means they are fitting into this archetypal symbology, so I should think about, I should read this myth again. And instead, what he's doing is he's constantly just coming from a place of total humility and ignorance, and asking the spirits themselves to explain to him what the hell is going on in any given moment, which ultimately he finds a very wise thing to do, because they do it inevitably. The more that he asks the spirits to explain to him what's going on, the more that the spirits then transform and move and shift and allow him to detach and disidentify from the ego that's so uncertain and terrified of what's going on, and connect with the larger self that is able to contain this experience and transform it and move through it as a fluid, organic organism in process. So, and I think that's another interesting aspect of Jung that people don't necessarily talk, or at least I've read a lot, talking about with the break with Freud, in that Jung had this conception of the self that Freud didn't necessarily adhere to. In terms of, and for Jung, this self was very much not just the self in terms of a separate sort of Cartesian, I think therefore I am, entity separate from everyone else around them, but the self as the innate connection to divinity, as that larger self and presence that contains all of these contradictory forces, that is actually a gateway through the self, through the body, to this vast cosmology of spirits that we're inhabiting. And so I think in that containing of the self, it opens up a gateway past the rational, scientific, materialist Western standards that Peter was talking about, somewhat of just the only goal being a producing member of society from psychology, and instead the goal of this connection to this larger self, that there's this unraveling of all the stories getting in the way between you and your innate connection to divinity and authenticity, as a goal, a sort of, I want to say superhuman, but that's not really the word I'm looking for. It's more this to be a human being, an indigenous concept, is someone who has come into relationship with the vast ecosystem of spirits that are inhabiting the world with you, all of your relationships. And I think to me that is the Jungian definition of the self, so to speak, though he didn't use those exact words. And so I think what I think is interesting now when you go back to archetypes and how they're used today, again, as categories so often, particularly in occultist communities, we often see archetypes used as an excuse to sort of not necessarily pay attention to the protocol or the history of individual deities or spirits, to just be able to say, oh, it's a crone spirit, or so I'm going to treat it this way, rather than like, I think Morpheus Ravenna, I remember reading something she wrote about that the differentiation between a crone figure and, say, a crone figure as an aspect of the Morrigan, that if you saw that figure, it would mean that you were about to die. So there's a big differentiation between, oh, I'm going to go engage with this loving, maternal crone figure who's going to give me all this wisdom, versus, oh, I'm actually seeing an aspect of this deity that's a specific protocol, that when I see this imagery, the interpretation of that in this specific cultural context that I'm entering into is that it's a warning that I'm about to die. So, a quote that Jung makes about the archetypes is that the archetype is a psychoid factor that belongs to the invisible, ultraviolet end of the psychic spectrum. It seems to be probable that the real nature of the archetype is not capable of being made conscious, that it is transcendent. Archetypes are images and at the same time emotions. One can speak of an archetype only when two aspects collide. When it is only an image, it is merely a word like picture, like a corpuscle with no electric charge. It is then of little consequence, just a word and nothing more. But if the image is charged with numinosity, that is psychic energy, then it becomes dynamic and will produce consequences. It is a great mistake in practice to treat an archetype as if it were a mere name, word, or concept. It is far more than that. It is a piece of life, an image connected with the individual by the bridge of emotion. So again, rather than categories, what Jung is talking about, and I think which is much more closer to how indigenous cosmologies engage with energies that you might call or parallel to Jungian archetypes, are these cosmic forces that are in a sense perhaps older than the gods, or related to the gods, in the sense that they're the sort of source code or building blocks of the universe. These things that are, that we can only, they're so vast that when we engage them in our internal landscape as humans, we can only engage with them as our inner version of that vast cosmic force that is constantly shifting and changing as we grow in our capacity to relate to this vast cosmic force. So I think that one of the common one of the common paths, ground between shamanism and Jungian psychology is the sense that there's this sense that humans are not necessarily at the center of it all. That there's this sense of this larger, vast network that we're tapping through our sense of individuation, rather than an aim to become the apex of evolution or in control of these vast forces of chaos. It's more that we're working and striving to come into relationship of this vast network through the engagement with these energies. And so I guess the last thing I just wanted to talk about with archetypes, in a sense, is that I think there's a danger sometimes in becoming too fixated or identified with any one archetype, and that there's a danger in using archetypes as a shortcut to relate to the gods, in a sense that the gods are very much tied up with these human stories over time, and they have their own agency, so to speak, and they have their own protocol, with good reason. Because, and in Jung's experiences with his spirits, he was in a culture where he was left without that protocol and forced to just completely engage on his own with these vast numinous entities. So, for him, what he came back to continuously and what allowed him to engage with these forces that can be quite dangerous without that protocol was this willingness to ask. And I guess that's what I would like to end the talk with today, is just an invitation in our own experiences with these energies, these vast numinous forces, rather than trying to box them into one category, the willingness to simply ask them what's going on, and then to interpret those actions of what's going on, and then based on those interpretations to take action, and even if that action is to ask another question, and then from those actions to finally come to a concrete thing that you're doing in the world, to notice how the world responds to that action, and based on that response, to then go back to the energies that you're engaging with. And I think that is one of the first steps in engaging with these forces for transformation.
Screenwriter, producer, and showrunner. He created and wrote the Sky Arts anthology horror series, The Nightmare Worlds of H.G. Wells, starring Michael Gambon. He also created and wrote all 53 episodes of BBC Three's dark comedy drama Ideal, starring Johnny Vegas, 3 series of Radio 4's sci-fi sitcom Nebulous, starring Mark Gartis, and BBC 2's Dr. Terrible's House of Horrible, starring Steve Coogan. He script edited the movie Alan Partridge, Alpha Papa, as well as 7 series of Radio 4's Sony Award-winning Count Arthur Strong's radio show. As an actor, his appearances include Doctor Who and the Harry Potter films. He also writes about art, music, and underground culture, and owns a modest collection of contemporary and surrealist art.
I'm going to stand up, not for my shadow's sake, but because my backside's going to sleep. Can we switch the lights off? Is that possible? Just because the slides are going to be pretty faint with the lights, and I don't know if it's possible to take those on. Another thing I should say is that the images we're going to look at, for some reason, the projector stretches them out, so we're not really seeing them as they are. But you know, yeah, there you go. So possible to switch the lights off?
So here's the thing with the lights, if we're willing to wait, it's possible, but someone actually has to scale these beams because the lights would be on the ceiling.
That's a classic design. That may end up being a bit distracting whilst I'm talking. All right.
I've never done it, and I'm not willing to start today.
Okay, all right. So you're going to have to squint and imagine that they're swatched over. So John Balance, born Geoffrey Lawrence Burton in 1962, is best known as the vocalist and lyricist with the British experimental band Coil. Now, many musicians and bands would refer to themselves as experimental, yet paradoxically, many of them employ a signature style. But John Balance and his partner in both Life and Coil, Peter Christopherson, were relentless experimentalists. From 1982 until Balance's untimely death in 2004, Coil repeatedly switched and flipped their modes of expression, from synth pop to atonal noise, from delicate string arrangements to acid house club tracks, to dronescapes, film soundtracks, ritual music, sequencer-driven cosmiche, industrial cacophony, and beyond into the truly uncategorisable. Seldom was a group so unrestricted in the scope of its endeavours. Interestingly, in relation to Coyle's recordings, Balance was fond of saying, "We made the studio sacred, and then we blasphemed." That is to say, they created a restriction and then rebelled against it. Now, whilst the sonic elements of their work may frequently have changed and evolved, Coyle's lyrical concerns remain fairly consistent. The cosmology of interest, which included hedonism, viewed as an heroic pursuit, life seen as a primal arena, the price of existence being eternal warfare, man at the mercy of elemental forces, the bestial being close to the celestial, the outsider as gifted visionary, death viewed as an integral part of human existence, and of course a fascination with magic and the occult in its various forms, with of course creativity itself seen as a magical act. Now, largely unknown to the outside world, throughout Coyle's career, Balance was also privately, yet prolifically, producing a vast body of visual artworks. Works which were never intended to be exhibited, works which were never intended to be seen by anyone, except perhaps for a few close friends. Works which were kept tucked away in notebooks, drawing pads, or green box files. Until 2014, when the first edition of the Balance monograph, Bright Lights and Cats with No Mouths, was published, very few people were even aware of the existence of these paintings and drawings. And it's clear that Balance himself didn't regard his artworks as worthy of much, if any, serious consideration. So because of the secretive nature of their creation, much of what I've got to say is opinion and speculation. With the exception of the materials used in the creation of these works and the dates that were created, there are very few facts about John Balance's artworks, and even the dates of some of the pieces are unknown. But one thing is for certain. In his visual artwork, Balance applied the same open-ended experimental approach which characterised Coyle's musical output. We can see this in terms of both the range of styles he employs and the variety of media he chooses to manifest his work. He switched freely between coloured pencil drawings, collages, watercolours, purely abstract paintings, cartoons, grotesque caricatures, surrealistic landscapes, and so on. Now, one possible reason for Balance's ability to leap from style to style, medium to medium, is the private nature of their creation. An artist's signature style is often their selling point, so many visual artists will think long and hard before changing direction. But there was absolutely no public conception of Balance as a visual artist, so he was free to do whatever he wished. So this incredibly stretched out version here is a piece called Wood Fury. It's from 1988. It's a strange creature composed of citrus slices, chicken claws and energy waves, and it's hovering near a wooded area. There are stars and a crescent moon in the sky, but it's also a bright blue sky, so it's almost as if this has been created like one of those films from the 60s or 70s where they use day for night shooting. And I think it's one of his finest works. Can you change the slide? So in fucking hell. So there's some smudges. That's actually a really beautiful piece of work. This is going to be a bit odd because I'm going to be showing you things that you can't really see, but then it is about the occult, so there we go. I think it's best to do the highlight of the talk early. This is a purely abstract painting. We don't know the date of this one. It's a soulful and brooding piece, believe me, and it pays repeated study. You have to buy the book and have a look, frankly. What Balance has done here is he's got thick pigment and scraped it across the surface of the paper. And if you could actually see this, it's sort of analogous with some of the abstract works of Gerhard Richter. Next one, please. Okay. This is something very different again. This is a coloured pencil drawing from 1990. Whilst the majority of Balance's works deploy automatism and chance, this is clearly a planned piece with a real delicacy and lightness of touch. This may be an imagined space, but more likely it's an actual garden which Balance either visited or knew well. Now, this space might not fit in with the image we have of Balance as the wild, surrealistic visionary. But it shows that for Balance, the creative floodgates were always open, and rather than simply trawling his subconscious, he was capable of engagement with visual reality. So as this range of third images shows, Balance was an arch experimenter, unwilling to be pinned down to one mode of expression. But of course, by definition, not all experiments will come off. Not everything balanced turns to gold. And I feel sure there are pieces included in the monograph that he would have felt a little bit awkward about being exposed to the public. And there are numerous occasions where his vision clearly exceeded his technical abilities. Now, often, Balance would experiment with mind-altering drugs and then draw or paint whilst under those influences. So sometimes this would produce startling results. But it's probably not too presumptuous to say that there were occasions when the chemical altered state of his mind would actually be curbing his technical abilities. And without doubt, there are pieces in this monograph which could easily and perhaps rightly be dismissed as stone doodles. But equally, there are other pieces which could be just as easily dubbed stoned masterworks. And as one might expect, there are strong recurring themes: death, demons, dogs, hybrid beasts, unknown gods, spirit worlds, oneric visions, the sun, the moon, and so on. Personal obsessions with universal resonance. And one of the key elements to many of Balance's works is eroticism and the manifestation of sexual energy. Look at the next one. Now, this, believe me, is a really beautiful piece of work. Now, Balance's work can sometimes feel like quite a cock-heavy one. Again, this should come as no surprise because the cursory glance at the song titles and lyrics that Balance composed for Coil quickly reveal a fascination with erotic desire, sexual energy, and sensual overload. Coil were, after all, dedicated explorers of the altered state, and sexual excitation and orgasm are amongst life's greatest altered state. Now, this is a piece called Horse, drawn in 1988 in ink and coloured crayons. Crayons, not a medium which is used very often by artists. A red horse stands, I might as well describe it to you. A red horse stands on its hind legs. All around nature is wild and tame in a technical ecstasy. The red horse stares out at us with a soft and charming eye, but there's no doubt that our attention is being directed to the nipples and especially the weighted penis. This is sexuality seen as a form of savage yet noble splendour. Also, you can't really see, but the nipples and the navel and the penis also sort of form a human face, which I think perhaps reminds us that man is just another animal with sexual urges. Next one. This is... this is what you can actually see. This, perhaps unsurprisingly, is called Penis Dog. We don't know the date that this was made, but here again, sexual energy is shown to be an animalistic urge. Also, these objects here in this corner could be, they've got testicles at the bottom, these could be like penis plant, which remind us that sexual urges are part of nature, or they could be sort of penis aliens, which suggest that sexual energy is inherently otherworldly and as such in conflict with the sort of cosy domestic construct of the house there at the top. Next one. This is virtually unrecognisable from what it's This is an untitled coloured pencil drawing from 88. Male genitals in the middle form part of this creature. It's like a sort of alien being, part meat, part vegetable, an entity from the world of sci-fi. And it's got a strange eye staring out from the middle. And this is a perverse being, but nevertheless an erotic one. This is Portrait of a Sexual Demon, again from 88, ink and coloured pencil on paper. The demon is depicted as a grotesque clown. Its own penis, partially erect, is dripping and somehow a little bit apologetic, I think. Meanwhile, nearby, two disembodied hands are masturbating a double-headed penis, and there's gobs of sperm sort of shooting in both directions. To me, this feels like a depiction of someone who recognises they're at the beck and call of their rapacious sexual appetites, perhaps suggesting that John was at the mercy of the sexual demon. And yet, elsewhere, the next one, Balance treats sexuality and desire in a far more playful and humorous manner. This one is called Dinosaur Dick. So there you go. Next one. This is Happy Penis. It's getting up there. Next one. And that's Nazi knob enders. The next one. And this is the delightfully titled Mythologically Strange Female Sees Burning Vision of Pork Sword. So these drawings aren't so much erotic as they are camp. That's to say, they exhibit some of camp's key attributes, namely ostentatious display, exaggeration and impertinence. And again, this could easily be construed as Balance attempting to throw us off the scent. By infusing his work with crude and camp elements, is he saying, don't pay too much attention to this, it's all a bit silly. Yet, clearly, camp, crudity and sexual innuendo are far from incompatible with high art. In fact, these very elements play a part in some of the most revolutionary of art. The work of Marcel Duchamp is heavily weighted towards camp, crudery and sexual innuendo. Be it the deployment of a urinal as an artwork, the reproduction of the Mona Lisa bearing the coded message, she has a hot ass, or his final work, which is the Étant donné, look at occasions, in Balance's writings and lyrics, including the Cole Manifesto, is the description of coil as decadent and symmetrical. That sounds like a phrase rich with Blakean portent. It is in fact a quote from a French and Saunders comedy sketch, wherein Dawn French, in the role of an art critic, says, I like anything, as long as it's decadent and symmetrical. Anybody know that? Is that new information? Again, this doesn't quite fit with the popular image of Balance as a wide-eyed, surrealistic visionary, but camp playfulness very much is a key element of both Cole's music and Balance's visual art. With this in mind, I toyed with giving this talk a far less reverent title. Options included Experimental Bent, which looks quite good, John Balance, The Magic Marker, but for the longest time, my favourite title was Pork, Sword and Sorcery. Can we look at that? So this is a quite sort of manic, detailed piece. This is done in felt tip. And you'll notice that a lot of the works are done in magic marker, biro, felt tip and so on, tools which are very rarely used by fine artists. And perhaps Balance was reaching for whatever tool was available in the moment of inspiration. If so, we can read this as him rising to the challenge of him taking these really unsophisticated tools and creating something of visual significance. Or we can flip it round and say this is yet another example of him perhaps unconsciously, distancing his artworks from serious consideration. By using biros and felt tips, he's saying, this isn't fine art, these are just domestic daubs. But whatever the reason for Balance's use of these tools, there's one definite knock-on effect. Unlike graphite or pigment, biros and magic markers cannot be removed or reworked. What lands on the page stays on the page. There's space for elaboration, but not for erasure. So this shows Balance's commitment to the automatic process. As I mentioned earlier, the majority of Balance's works were created via automatic drawing or painting. And this is a technique which we readily associate with surrealism. It was pioneered by the French surrealist artist Abrahamsson. It's a way of removing rational control and allowing the image to flow directly from the psyche onto the page, what surrealist leader André Breton referred to as pure psychic automatism. Now, Balance was a huge fan of several surrealist artists and had a number of their works in his personal collection, and it's easy to view his own work through the prism of surrealism. And yet Balance, while clearly plugging into the energy of surrealism and celebrating its privileging of chance and accident, he appears to be doing it largely on his own terms. Many contemporary artists who engage with surrealist tropes end up, I think, mining themes which were exhausted decades ago. I'm sure we're all familiar with contemporary art, which uses some of the key signifiers of surrealistic imagery: bowler hat, eyeballs, people dressed in the fashions of the 20s and 30s, ladders leading up to clouds, sort of subdiluvian landscapes and so on. Look at the next one. There's somebody who clearly thought, oh yeah, Dali did some swans with elephants for heads, I'll do elephants with tubers for heads. And it's all a bit lame, frankly. Artists like this make the mistake of thinking that surrealism is a distinct visual style rather than an attitude or state of mind. So to me, stuff like this ends up being a sort of visual karaoke. It's a sort of out-of-tune rendition of a classic form, if you like. The thing is, if you look at the first and second wave of surrealist artists, Salvador Dali, Max Ernst, Leonard Feeney, Hans Bellman, and so on, there's very little crossover in terms of imagery, and that's because each of the artists followed their own distinct obsessions. And it's sort of quite ludicrous to think that you could pick up another artist's obsessions and use them and expect that your own work would resonate with the same power. It's a bit like sort of putting on a head chef's hat and assuming that then you'll be able to make a gourmet meal. It's just not possible. So, Balance himself, though, was not above utilising stylistic devices of other artists, and one clear example of this is the artist Brian Geising. And there he just about is, looking like a saint. Geising was one of the key figures of the Beat generation. Unlike fellow Beats Jack Kerouac, William S. Burroughs and Allen Ginsberg, Geising never really made the crossover into proper public consciousness in terms of the wider consciousness of the public. But he's easily got a claim to have an equal, if not greater, impact than someone like Kerouac. Geising wrote novels. He was an accomplished poet who pioneered the form of the permutation poem. He also created, or if you prefer, discovered the cut-up technique, a form of word-based collage. I'm sure most of you are very familiar with this, whereby pre-existing text are spliced together. Geising showed it to his friend and former lover, William S. Burroughs, who saw the possibilities and went on to utilise it in a series of novels, including Soft Machine and Neighbour Express. But clearly the cut-up has ramifications far beyond the world of literature, into the other arts, into magic, and so on. Geising also created the Dream Machine. There it just about is. It's a stroboscopic device which pulsates at frequency, which alters the brain's electrical oscillations, thereby causing hallucinations. You view it with your eyes closed. As soon as you open your eyes, the hallucinations are gone and you're back to normal. Geising was interested in cultural disobedience. He believed that the artist is the eternal outsider, and he was openly queer at a time when such honesty could lead to quite serious consequences. So for all these reasons, Geising, it was an obvious touchstone for both Balance and Christopherson. But the element of this oeuvre which concerns us closely here is his work as a visual artist. He was a highly accomplished painter and collagist, exhibited internationally. When he was quite young, he'd studied Japanese and Arabic, and his work had long felt the influence of calligraphy. But Geising claimed that his true fascination with the calligraphic form came in 1956 in Morocco. Geising had opened a restaurant in Tangier by the name The 1001 Nights, yet he was obviously quite unpopular with the locals because one day he found a small pouch lodged behind one of the restaurant walls, and upon opening the pouch, he realised it was a curse. Inside was an amulet, seeds, pebbles, 7 shards from a broken mirror, small balls of hair matted with blood, a cut-out silhouette of Geising himself, and crucially, a square of paper with a spell written on it, in lines both right to left and up and down, thus forming a grid. And the grid of words read, "Make Master Brahim leave this house, as smoke leaves the fire, never to return." And sure enough, a little while later, the restaurant folded and Geising was out with just the shirt on his back. But the grid of words made an indelible impression on his artistic sensibilities, and from then on, the grid and calligraphy became integral. In fact, they became the mainstay of pretty much all Geising's visual artworks. It's there, believe me, it's in there somewhere. The fact he was inspired by a curse, and a successful one at that, is deeply significant. It shows that for Geising, art and magic would come to occupy the same space. Similarly, he refused to distinguish between word and image. Geising described the grid as the bright jungle gym of mathematics, an exercise for controlling matter and knowing space. And interestingly, what we see in Geising's work is the tension between the formal certainty of the grid and the swirling chaos which he weaves around it. Geising seems to see the grid not as a limiting form, but something to struggle against or overcome. And there's obvious echoes in this, I think, with Balance's statement, "We made the studio sacred, then we blasphemed." That is, putting in place an area of restriction, only to then react against it. Look at the next one. So, Balance's work quite often shows echoes of Geising's. He combines calligraphic forms with grid formations. Now, although these works are looser and have a more lyrical tone than Geising's, they also appear to be spells or incantations. Balance's handwriting asserts his individuality. The repetition of the words affirms their power, whilst the grid symbolically locks in their meaning. Next one. Yet, if these are spells or incantations, then we cannot know what their purpose or intention was. These are private spells, and that's a major part of their power. In some of the calligraphic pieces, the words are clear. In others, the text has been more densely woven together. Words are seen not just in terms of meaning, but in terms of shape and pattern. The latter become deliberately entangled, densely woven together, and the individual meanings are subsumed by magical intent. This is a coloured pencil drawing from 1988 entitled Prayer. Both its title and its form tell us this was an image with spiritual and magical intent. Here we can see Balance as operating away from the more direct influence of Geising, With its restricted colour palette, it's got a real delicacy, a fluidity and grace, and I think this is possibly the best of his calligraphic works. But one of the most significant aspects to prayer, I think, is that here balance is dispensed with recognisable language altogether. The pencil marks are as much like musical notation as they are like text. Here balance is invoking magic, the language is purely his own. Right. This is a watercolour and felt tip piece from 94 entitled Noise or Signal, Disabled Landscape with Language. Here, as the title suggests, balance is taking language into a direct engagement with the natural world. The language becomes a component of the landscape itself. This is all text, you can't see, these are all words, really minutely written out. So the language becomes a component of the landscape, but it's interesting Balance described this as a disabled landscape. I think what he's suggesting is that language itself can actually act as a barrier to understanding, that by introducing language into the landscape, we're disabling nature and preventing it from being understood on its own terms. The label is not the thing, the description is not the thing, this is not the pipe dream. Now, the other artist who inevitably arises when we talk about the work of John Balance is, of course, the British artist and occultist Austin Osman Spare. Sorry, can we look at the one after this first, actually? This is a pastel drawing from 1957. Spare was born in 1886. He occupies quite a unique position in the history of British art. Balance and Christopherson were both avid collectors of Spare. This is one of the pieces that was in their vast collection. It's called Tree of Knowledge, and it incorporates a portrait of Joyce Bernard. Now, much modern-day discussion of Spare centres on his outsider status, focuses on the archetypical image of the starving, eccentric artist in the garret, whilst his reputation as an occult magician obviously pushes him further to the margins of society. But we should remember that Spare has started out on a very conventional and conservative path. He was the son of a policeman, he studied art at the Royal College of Art, he was an official war artist, and initially he exhibited at fashionable London galleries. But he would go on to develop a highly personalised and detailed system of magical beliefs. He also employed automatic drawing, a technique he developed contemporaneously to the surrealists, but completely separately to them. And he believed that often his hand was being guided by spirits or elemental forces. It wasn't him doing the drawing, it was some other force. But can we go back to the previous one? This is a portrait of Steffi Graf. Steffi Graf? Steffi Grant, sorry. So this is a sidereal portrait. This is also from Balance and Christopherson's collection. Spare pioneered siderealism, which is a visual experimentation with a logarithmic form of anamorphic projection, which leads to what you might call these slightly slanted images. Now, I asked Balance's close friend and fellow Cole member Ossian Brown how many artworks of Austin Osman Spare, Balance and Christopherson owned. He told me about 90 individual pieces, plus an entire bound notebook which contained all the original drawings for Spare's Book of Ugly Ecstasy. So it's fairly safe to say that the imagery of Spare was a constant feature in the home life of Balance. So obviously it's quite tempting, knowing that, to start looking for traces of Spare's style in the work of Balance. But in truth, I think there's very little to be found. Spare was a painter of great technical skill, and he was a draftsman par excellence, whilst Balance's approach is best described as intuitive or perhaps primitivist. Yet we can see threads of Spare's cosmology of interests in Balance's work, in his depiction of worlds populated by demons and elementals, in his embracing of the grotesque, in the belief that sometimes the artist's hand is guided by spirits, and of course in his employment of automatic drawing. Now, although the visual influence of Spare may be slight, Balance's relationship with Spare went well beyond the imagistic. In an interview with 14 Times magazine in 2001, Balance said, "I have a very intimate relationship with Spare. He's my mentor. I communicate with him through his pictures and often ask his advice as an ancestor. A lot of his beliefs were shamanic and to do with ancestor worship. I don't have a very close connection with my ancestors, my real family, other than my mother's parents. So I talk to Spare for advice. I think he still exists, in his art and in the ether. He's around as a helper." He then jokingly goes on to say, "That sounds a bit flaky, doesn't it? Maybe I should catch it in cyber terms." So it's certainly easy to imagine that Balance would be communing with the Spare pictures in his collection, such as this one, and seeking answers, be they questions to personal issues or perhaps creative decisions. Now, Balance and Christopherson had a lifelong interest in magic, the arcane and the occult, but they were far from purists. Their interests include paganism, Discordianism, Thelema and so on. But rather than embrace one true faith or one specific doctrine, they cherry-picked the items, the beliefs, the themes that were particularly inspiring to them personally. And sometimes they just simply take the spirit of an idea or a practice. And of course, art itself can be seen as an alchemical act, the transmutation of base materials such as pigment, clay, paper and canvas into items of visual, spiritual and monetary worth. Yet for Balance, there was no question of him showing his artwork to people or selling them. It was a private affair, as indeed most magical acts are. Now, there are numerous possible reasons for Balance not pushing his artworks out into the public arena, the most obvious being he believed they were of no real intrinsic artistic worth. I asked Ossie and Brown about Balance's opinion of his own work. He said he loved painting and drawing, but he wasn't greatly confident, and he was quite dismissive of his pictures technically. In a letter to Val, Balance described his own work as rubbish. So whether he chose to imbue the works with magical intent or not, it's possible he viewed them simply as the overflow of an ever-active creative mind. And of course, we can't underestimate what it must have been like living and working with an artist of the scope and stature of Peter Christopherson. Aside from being a musician, Christopherson was a photographer, graphic designer, film, video and commercial director. He was one of 3 partners in the world-famous Hypnosis design team, and as such was responsible for some of the most iconic album themes of the 70s and 80s. So next one. That's Pink Floyd's Wish You Were Here. So he did sleeves with Led Zeppelin, Peter Gabriel, Pink Floyd, and a lot of these images became ubiquitous and iconic. And you've got to remember that whilst we're the sort of people who go to art galleries, actually a very small proportion of society will ever step foot in an art gallery. But album cover artwork, particularly in the era of the 12-inch sleeve, is potentially seen by millions of people. So Peter's work was really out there and really visible, and it's easy to see. Can we look at the next one? It's easy to see in the shadow. See, that actually looks fine depicted like that. It's easy to see that in the shadow of the sort of very technically adept and sophisticated work of Christopherson, that Balance, sitting at home on tour, filling notebooks with images in ballpoint and marker pen, could easily begin to dismiss his own work as mere sketches and doodles of little consequence or purpose. Now, I might seem to be overstating Balance's reluctance to have his visual artworks put out there for consideration, but consider this. Have a look at another one. That's beautiful. I think it's a really beautiful, really sort of perfectly realised piece of work. But just consider, like, by most band standards, Kyle's discography is enormous. Scores of albums, EPs, live recordings, CDRs, scores of things released under alternative names and so on. And yet, with the exception of a handful of limited release CDRs, not one of them has artwork on the cover by Balance, which I think is a real shame because several of these images would, I think, make superb sleeve artwork. Look at the next one. Beautiful. And the next one. So I think, in conclusion, I'd just like to say that although it's obvious that Balance himself placed very little value on his artwork, the fact that he was continually producing visuals with no thought for anything other than experimenting and finding and exploring different modes of expression may well be his art's greatest strength, because in the end, the unguarded nature of this work's creation means that these images provide a direct line to the unconscious of a truly visionary artist. And have a look in the book, because these look shit on here, but they look really good in the book. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to Rendering Unconscious. You've just heard a panel from the Psychoanalysis, Art, and the Occult Conference held at Candid Arts Trust in London, May 2016. Val Denham presented Proclaim Present Time Over. Langston Kahn with The Thing Which Knowledge Can't Eat, Gods, Archetypes, and the Mind. And Graham Duff with Sublime Fragments, The Art of John Balance, moderated by Caleigh Fisher. For more, please visit my website, drvanessasinclair.net, the podcast website, renderingunconscious.org, or the conference website, PSYCHOANALYSIS.org. That's PSYCHARTCULT.org. Papers from the Psychoanalysis, Art, and the Occult Conference have been collected together into the Fenris Wolf, Volume 9, edited by myself and Carl Abrahamsson. Available from Trapart.net. Rendering Unconscious is also a book. Rendering Unconscious, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry. Available from Trapart Books, 2019. Please visit our publisher's website, www.trapart.net. You can support the podcast by visiting our Patreon, patreon.com/VANESSA23CARL. Your support is greatly appreciated. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode. And now, message 23.
Memories, pandragine, with other individuals, come into, to, and explores the dilemma, all when we're of the species, existential fears, the meaning, transitional mind, for serving as a political. Governors are dropping shows between head that was. Would it be? Who led this? Ourselves think this. As below, so above. I want eating out, baptizing meat, associated with a bonfire blazing. However, ripping molds and a body, self, a crust, or a scab. Out wild, only child, worked over in the mind. Situations, primary, creating by breaking. For in, all, only. Play, wrist, pleasure. Memories, pandragine, with other individuals, come into, to, and explores the dilemma, all when we're of the species, existential fears, the meaning, transitional mind, for serving as a political. Governors are dropping shows between head that was. Would it be? Who led this? Ourselves think this. As below, so above. I want eating out, baptizing meat, associated with a bonfire blazing. However, ripping molds and a body, self, a crust, or a scab. Out wild, only child, worked over in the mind. Situations, primary, creating by breaking. For in, all, only. play, wrist, pleasure, nor brutality of war. Don't muse by structure of the privileged. When exercises over, that she was grief. It is start of the show, roused him. She, nevertheless, he had a celestial, over it twice, as they sparked an element of, and they were soon, and we lay in the, and we touched the memories, pantogyne, with other individuals, come into, to, and explores the dilemma, all when we're of the species, existential fears, the meaning, transitional mind, for serving as a political. Governors are dropping shows between head that was. Surrealism.